Friends, good evening and welcome to the third in our series of conversations with the clerk for 2023. It's good to be with you all. Thanks for joining us. In a minute, we will start some conversation and everything, but first, we'd like to open us with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for gathering us as your people and for giving us the gift of your church. We thank you for the many servants who work in our churches and around our world to support our congregations and the many expressions of your faithfulness and your ministry in our midst. We ask your blessing upon this conversation and and upon all who gather tonight, that the work we do together tonight and in our congregations and beyond might show your love to our weary world. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So the first thing we do in these conversations is just a quick round of introductions. Just a reminder of an outline of where we are and where we have been. We have started out in this with we started on July 18th with the big picture. Our last meeting, we talked about policies, procedures, and manual items for sessions. Tonight, we are talking about new requirements from the Book of Order for pastors and their congregations. And on November 7th, we will talk about the new church discipline section of the Book of Order. So if you are just excited and ecstatic about how we deal with discipline in the church, mark your calendars for November 7th. Recordings of all of the previous sessions are available on the Presbytery's website and YouTube page. So if you miss something, you can always catch up. So the big thing I want to just point out, these few changes about things to know about what's different. And we'll get into the details of each of these. First of all is the removal of honorably from the name of the roll of retired ministers. This was actually probably the most heated discussion at General Assembly last summer, was whether or not ministers should be honorably retired. I realized as I was going through this that another big change that we did not talk about at our last one was the question of electronic meetings. And so I want to point out that tonight that there are new requirements and provisions related to electronic meetings that churches and pastors need to be aware of. And I put it under pastors and their congregations and felt okay about it, not just because I forgot at the last one, but also because pastors are in charge of session and congregational meetings, and they are responsible for conducting them decently and in order. The big one that everybody is thinking about that we'll get into is the family medical leave. That the terms of call for installed pastors must include 12 weeks of paid family medical leave. Again, we'll get into the details of that. I will share with you the draft of the policy that the Committee on Ministry is presenting to Presbytery next month, and that should help you understand how that needs to be implemented in church. And finally, there's new clarity about boundaries training requirements. This is it, and we will get into the details of that as well. And that mainly relates to ministers, but there are things that sessions need to do otherwise. So we'll start out with the retired minister's role because it's a relatively simple change. This is a change at G-20503 to rename the role of retired ministers to remove the word honorably. So now it is simply the retired minister's role. It also removed the reasons for that retirement from the Book of Order because there are plenty of good reasons that someone could be marked as retired. It's entirely possible that a younger person might want to be considered a retired minister because they feel that they have concluded their active service to the church. If they are anticipating a change in their vocation, and they don't want to give up their ordination, but they don't intend to be active in the practice of ministry, they could ask that they be placed on the retired roll. Overall, this is designed to simplify the requirements and the language related to this I will tell you, I do not see any substantial change to practice related to the retired minister's role, except that when someone requests to be retired, we will act to place them on the role of retired ministers, not the role of honorably retired ministers. Now, that was, Iris can tell you, at General Assembly, and even when we discussed amendments in the Presbytery, there was a lot of discussion about this. So, are there any questions on this before we move to the next section?
I just wondered, did you have more than one list before?
So there are 3 roles of ministers.
Okay.
There are the ministers.
That, so I just didn't
Sure.
know.
Yeah, most clerks of session wouldn't. That makes sense. Like there are 3 roles of ministers because there are 3 statuses for ministers. One is engaged in a validated ministry. And those are pastors of congregations and those people whose ministries have been validated by the presbytery. The second status is member at large. Member at large is a minister who has not given up their practice of ministry, but is not currently engaged in something that's considered a validated ministry. And then there are retired ministers. So those are the 3 statuses that we can assign to a minister. Other questions? All right, so we'll move on to the next provision, which is related to electronic meetings. So this is new language at G-30105. There's similar language in the section about congregational meetings. So this is about the provisions for any meeting of a council of the church at any level. So this could be session up to General Assembly. And this is just kind of authorizing language. In accordance with the requirement of Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, councils and their commissions and committees may meet electronically, provided that the technology employed allows for all members present to hear and be heard simultaneously. This includes joining one or more persons electronically to an otherwise in-person meeting. Councils should adopt special rules of order and standing rules to govern such meetings. I mentioned this in part because because of that last sentence about adopting special rules of order and standing rules to govern these meetings. There are a few things that I think you should consider and put in your manual of operations when you're thinking about electronic meetings. The first is to actually give permission. Remember, this language is permissive, not required. It is may language. So you want to actually give permission to do this in your manual of operations and potentially even your bylaws. And the permission has to require simultaneous oral communication. That's Robert's Rules language, the Book of Order language you saw in the last slide. So just keep in mind that you have to be able to hear and be heard. It's not about being seen, it's about being heard. To be very clear, YouTube is not a platform that works for this. It's got to be something like Zoom or a conference call platform. So other things to include in your manual is you don't have to, there are various ways to handle this, and you need to figure out what you want to do based on your particular congregation's needs. First of all, is there an option for electronic participation in some or all in-person meetings? Are you going to set up for hybrid? Or are you going to just say all meetings happen either in person or on Zoom? This is a question we've been asking in the Presbytery on a regular basis, trying to figure out how we want to organize our Presbytery meetings. And do we provide an electronic option for an in-person meeting? And then then related to that is, do all in-person meetings have to have this option? So If you're meeting in person and the technology goes down, do you have to stop the meeting? That's one of the questions. That sort of thing. Or is it possible that you could say, you know what, this meeting is so important, we need to be together in person, all of us. I personally would go with that latter. There are meetings that we need to be face to face. We need to be breathing each other's air to make that meeting most effective. Another question that you need to think about is who is authorizing the meeting to be electronic, if it's an option. So, if it says it can be either way, who declares that? Is it the moderator? Is it the clerk? Does the session have to vote to make it an electronic meeting? How does that work? And finally, this question of what about other entities? Can the congregation meet electronically? If your congregation is 40 or 50 people, that's going to be a different answer than a congregation of 1,000. Simply because of the complexities of technology. How do you do a meeting with 1,000 people? And can committees meet electronically? Because you need the session has to, it's not a default that they can do that. The session has to give them that permission. So just keep that in mind. Are there any questions about this?
Yeah. Always done that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So one of the things I'll also say about this, 3.5 years ago, we got plunged into a moment when we were not expecting this. We were not prepared for a world where all of our meetings would go electronic for 1 to 3 years. So if your language isn't perfect yet, that's fine. The Book of Order actually just got changed in July to officially permit all of this. So just remember, just keep that in mind. But think about these questions and put them in your next update. That's kind of my advice to folks.
Do you have any idea of any congregations actually not making their meetings hybrid when they're having the option for electronic participation?
So I think a lot of our congregations have moved back to fully in-person congregational meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I think the session meetings are a little more mixed. Okay. I only know of 1 or 2 because the technology that's required to pull off a good hybrid meeting is really hard. North Decatur is hosting our November Presbytery meeting, and they do this regularly. They know how to do it. They do it well. And so we are excited about being there because we don't have to set up the technology and everything. They've got it all wired and connected, and they practice it. For their congregational meetings, they do always have a hybrid option. But I would say most congregations now have moved back to a fully in-person meeting for the congregational meetings. Is that lining up with others' experience? I'm seeing some nods.
Yeah. Pretty much the only Zoom meetings we have right now are committee meetings, a few. But session has been in person, and the congregational meetings have too.
Okay. Hope that's helpful, Mary.
Sure. Yes.
Other questions or comments on this? So now we'll turn to the biggie in this conversation. There was one that comes at the end that's a little less big, but this is basically what this conversation with the clerk is focused on. And that is paid family medical leave. And each of those words is important, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This is an amendment at G-20804, which talks about the minimum terms of call for an installed pastor. You can see the text of the amendment here. The bold and italicized section is what we're kind of focusing on. The call shall include provision for a minimum of 12 weeks paid family medical leave. And that is kind of clarifying what the goal is here. And this applies to present and future calls. So when you can back up a sentence, we'll talk a little bit at the end about this. The session shall review annually the minister's terms of call and shall propose for congregational action such changes as the session deems appropriate, provided that they meet the presbytery's minimum requirements. And beginning July 9th, 2023, the presbytery's minimum requirements by default require a minimum of 12 weeks paid family medical leave. So now I've tried to break this up. We have a policy, which I will make sure you have a copy of. Every time we do this conversation, you might recall if you've been a part of one before, later on tonight or tomorrow, I will send out a link to a resource folder and to this recording so that you can see it and refer back to it. The resource listing in particular will include the draft of the paid family medical leave policy that the Committee on Ministry is recommending to the Presbytery. It will be voted on next month on November 4th. So the next piece of this is who is eligible. And there are two requirements. It must be a minister of word and sacrament serving in an installed relationship with a congregation. To be clear, other positions may be offered this leave, but the installed positions have to have it in the terms of call. So it's a pastor or associate pastor in an installed relationship. It must include this leave. There are 3 reasons for the leave that were defined by the General Assembly in its actions related to creating this. The first is the one that everybody is immediately thinking about, which is parental leave. Requiring 12 weeks, or permitting 12 weeks of paid leave within 1 year of birth or adoption by a pastor or the pastor's spouse. The second is caregiver leave, where a pastor's immediate family member requires care due to a major illness or disability. The third is medical leave, and that is a serious health condition that causes major illness or disability for the pastor. So those are your 3 reasons that the leave might come into play. The policy as COM is presenting it includes some important parameters. First of all, this is to be clear that it's up to 12 weeks, including Sundays, in a rolling 12-month period. So it's not 12 weeks per call. It's not 12 weeks at any time. It's 12 weeks in a rolling 12-month period. This is to make it easier to administer and say it's not about like you get 12 weeks per year. So if you get sick in October, you get 3 months, you get 12 weeks then, and then you can reset at the beginning of the next year. That's not the goal. That's why we said the rolling 12-month period. So if you start on October 1, if you go on leave on October 1, your 12-month period begins then. So the next time your clock would reset for the full 12 weeks is October 1 of the following year. We do ask that the pastor provide as much advance notice as possible. You don't have to call the session the day that you find out you're pregnant, but don't wait until you're on the way to the hospital. Now, if in some cases you obviously don't know, and the leave is going to be negotiated later. And that's totally okay, but that as much advance notice as possible. The goal here is to allow time for people to plan and work. One of the things that I think the group that put this together is really happy about the way it's shaped out is that the leave can be used consecutively or intermittently, including as a time offset. So you could take 12 weeks consecutively if you're celebrating the birth of a child. You could take, if you have a family member who's ill and you need to go be with them for 3 weeks and come back for a month and go back out for 3 more weeks, and take turns with other folks, that's an intermittent leave, and that's also permitted. The other possibility that the committee talked about was a time offset. This is where, so say at the birth of a child, you take 8 weeks off completely, and then you come back part-time for 8 weeks. That adds up to a total of 12 weeks because you've got that second 8 weeks at part-time is 4 weeks of full-time coverage. So that's, we wanted to build in as much flexibility that helps, as far as I'm concerned, that helps both the pastor and the church by giving some options. So maybe you only have to find 8 weeks of coverage for this. It just works better. To be clear, there is no waiting period of this. The eligibility begins on the first day of installed service and ends upon dissolution of the call. So that's also to be clear that it's not something you get credit for if you don't use it. During the leave, the pastor continues to receive all benefits. The leave may be combined with vacation time or other leave at the discretion of the pastor. But to be clear, it is not in lieu of vacation time. So it's not where you get 4 weeks vacation, and if you have to take medical leave, your vacation disappears as well. Finally, the pastor returns to the same positions, title, terms of call, hours worked, and job description after the leave. There is an exception on this if the pastor requests a change. So, for example, if someone goes out on medical leave and at the end of 12 weeks is in a space where they actually need to go down to half-time or something, and they can negotiate that with the church. The intent is, the policy is set up so that under normal circumstances, you return to where you were before. But if the pastor requests a change, it is permissible to change there. At the core of all of this are flexibility, grace, and communication. These are the keys to making this work. This is a new experience for the church. We're going to be facing this in a lot of different ways, but I think this is a really important moment for us to think about how we care for one another and for those who serve the gospel in our midst. A couple of things just to clarify what churches need to do. You need to include 12 weeks of paid family medical leave in the changes to the pastor's call the next time you present it to the congregation. And then you also should include language about paid family medical leave for the pastor to the session's personnel manual or similar document. The language there should be based on the presbytery policy. And to be clear, this policy is the minimum requirement for our congregations. It is considered part of the minimum terms of call. That's a lot of information about this. Again, I will make sure you get a copy of the whole policy, but I think I've tried to summarize it pretty well. Do you have any questions about it at this point?
Just a comment, if possible.
Sure.
other churches may not be having financial problems, but our church is getting smaller all the time, and we do have to be concerned about financial problems. And you know, this is not going to be easy for churches who aren't really rich, should I say, or who have a good savings deposit somewhere that they can use. And I just wonder that there's no place we can go for help. We have to do it this way, right?
Right. The one thing I will say, so there are options out there for certain situations. So, you know, if we jump back here to the different reasons for the leave. So for reasons 1 and 3, under certain circumstances, can be covered by short-term disability from the Board of Pensions. They are not guaranteed to be there. To be clear, I talked to Clark Simmons today. I should be absolutely clear. The Board of Pensions does not provide paid family medical leave. They are not responsible for that. But some of the programs they have in place to support our pastors can make this more affordable and feasible, particularly for the person giving birth. So if a pastor giving birth does have some eligibility for short-term disability. So that's one particular situation to keep in mind. And a pastor who has to go out on medical leave for a serious health condition could also be placed on short-term disability. So, you know, yes, there are major, there are considerations involved here, but to be really clear about it, that there are these options out there that churches need to explore and not be afraid of using those resources when they can. This is also a great opportunity to explore ways to connect with other churches. There are enough pastors out there to cover things like to do pulpit supply and that sort of thing in a season like that. I mean, we will work with you on that. So that's part of what the presbytery can do, is connect churches and people to do this. We've had one of our ministers actually has done 2 or 3. She did sabbatical coverage for a church, and she did medical leave coverage for the church, for 2 churches, I believe, over the last couple of years. So there are people who are good at this and who are open to it. And there's a certain amount you can't budget for in this, but this is part of how we care for one another. And if we're not caring for each other, it's really hard for folks to be pastor, and it's really hard for us to be church if we're not caring for each other. And so this is a way that ultimately we hope we can care better for each other. Are there other questions on this? You pop back to this slide. By the way, I will make sure you get these slides as well.
I can see there's I could see some pushback from congregation members, especially if you have say a pastor's spouse had the baby and then the pastor chooses to go out on that. I'm coming from where my daughter, who's a professor at a college and was pregnant, she really didn't get much support. And so even though technically the policy was in place, the support in her department was not there. So she basically started working after 3 weeks after giving birth. So is the presbytery available to come in and help with smoothing something like that over?
Yeah, so one thing that is not mentioned here, I didn't put it on the slide, but I will say it out loud for sure. The Committee on Ministry is, if there's any question, if there's any grind, rub, if we need to work with folks on this to interpret pieces of the policy or anything like that, yes, we are absolutely prepared to come in and have that conversation. So the goal here is not to make this a burden, but to help us be more joyful together. As in all the different ways we have to care for each other, that we can welcome a new child to the family of faith with the joy that we experience at baptism. We can care for those who are caring for their families in a time of deep need in the way that we hope we will do. And so, and we can care for those who are facing illness in this way, who have served among us faithfully. So, there are certainly going to be problems with it. But the church has spoken on this. The Book of Order got amended. We can't really debate that. We're at this point, we're just trying to make it possible to implement. And I if I'm asked, I will say, if the policy is voted down by the presbytery, it just actually makes it harder for our churches to implement it, because they've got to do it, and then they don't have clear guidance for how to do it. All right. And again, as I just pass back through these slides, just the importance of flexibility, grace, and communication in making this work. The way will be smoother if pastors can communicate early on about their needs. And the way will be smoother if sessions are open to that communication, rather than leaving pastors afraid to talk about it. So such that they have to come at the very last minute and ask for it as a last resort.
And Andy, one of the things that in terms of discussion of this from the committee level, when it came before our committee, was the need for the communication and all of the parties recognizing that we are in this together. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that is not necessarily understood, but we are all Christ's children, and we are all in this together.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. So the last of those changes you might recall is about boundaries training. And boundaries training has been a part of the work of this presbytery for a number of years, and as it has been in many, but it has not been required across the denomination. So now there is an explicit requirement at G30106 related to boundaries training. And that also now includes a time requirement. In addition, the other big change here is that policies and training are now also required in sessions, not just at the presbytery level. So what does this look like? What is included in boundary training? This is the quote from the Book of Order. Each council's policy shall include requirements for boundary training, which includes the topic of sexual misconduct, and child sexual abuse prevention training for its members at least every 36 months. So the key pieces of this training are about boundaries, appropriate boundaries, the topic of sexual misconduct, which is a portion of boundaries training, but not the only part of it, and child sexual abuse prevention training. Some people are parsing this as separate things. I think that the intent here is that that boundary training includes child sexual abuse prevention training, and that it happens every 36 months. That to me is the clearest intent and is the most helpful intent about this in the life of the church. So that's how I'm suggesting that the presbytery and our sessions interpret this. Who is involved? There are two, most importantly, the members of the council, that includes your session, are required to have boundaries training. So session members are required. And the policy can, and that include, and members of the council, including ministers in the presbytery. So, and if you ask the question, what about ruling elder commissioners? Ruling elder commissioners of presbytery are not members of the presbytery. So it's only the people who are members of the council. So members of people who are elected to session, the elders on session, and the minister members of the presbytery. Others may be directed by your policy. So your boundary training policy should say who else is required to get it. I would highly recommend that you include a requirement that all volunteers who work with children and other vulnerable persons be included in your required boundaries training. It's also wise to put church staff in. You might not have to do your you might not have to do your landscaper, but you might. You might not have to do your very part-time nursery worker, but you probably should. You might not think you don't need to do your church administrator because all they do is show up during the week, but they actually have a lot of contact with folks and may need to be a part of that as well. And they're alone in the building with people sometimes. So think about these kind of questions of who is best included in your policy. And others may need to be included as well. So, I think at a minimum, it's those volunteers who are working with children and any other vulnerable persons. Your staff you have to know your staff and figure out how that structure applies, and think about anybody else who might be who might be put in a situation where their integrity could be drawn into question. These are Andy's suggestions about boundaries training. First of all, there's a really nice thing here that this is required every 36 months. Most of our sessions have members who are elected for 36 months. And we do training with our elders every 3 years, which is 36 months. So, there's a great opportunity to build the training into your existing officer training programs. So when you elect a new officer, they need to go through the pastor's training about Presbyterian polity, learn about the structure of the session and how things are organized, and they need to do boundaries training. That might just be a really natural place to include it. And there are lots of different ways you can do this. So don't not look at online training options. So one component of your officer training might now be an online piece to deal with boundaries training. Andy's third suggestion is, this is a moment where it is a good thing to call your insurance company. They probably have some resources and would be glad to help you with this. This is risk management, basic risk management procedures in the life of the church. So they should be able to help you. The insurance board, which does have some of us have policies through the insurance board. They have a free program that's available to any Presbyterian church with some very basic online training, probably better than nothing. Maybe not perfect, but certainly a good starting point. My fourth recommendation is make sure you include some sort of enforcement mechanism for those who don't complete the training. If people don't stay current with this, they probably don't need to be teaching Sunday school for children. That's the kind of thing that, just be very clear. This has got to be, you've got to have some teeth to the policy. And we'll talk in a second about the presbytery's policy on boundaries training, because we have, for the first time, included some teeth in it. So it's important to track it, but it's important as well to make sure you know what you're going to do when somebody doesn't do it, and to be serious about that. And don't just slap them on the hand. There needs to be some way to move through that. So just a couple of notes about the presbytery's boundaries training policy. This policy, to be very clear, applies only to ministers and CREs, commissioned ruling elders. It does not apply to our churches. So you have to have your own boundaries training policy and program. Our program is limited to our ministers and commissioned ruling elders. That does include members at large and retirees who are serving our churches in a temporary relationship. The boundaries training is now exclusively provided through the presbytery. Has to be taken at least once every 3 years. It's not going to be radically different. There's no course 1, course 2, course 3. It's going to be the same basic stuff over and over again, because it's just 2 hours offered on Zoom 3 times a year. Costs $25 for ministers. And one of the, Reverend Han, your presence here tonight reminds me that we probably need to talk about doing this in Korean at some point in time. So, so I'm going to flag that coming out of our conversation. But the last piece of this is the teeth in our policy. Ministers who are not current with their boundaries training will not be considered in good standing or be eligible to transfer presbyteries or take new calls within this presbytery beginning January 1, 2025. So pretty much everybody is going to have to take boundaries training. We have about 200 active ministers or so who are going to have to take boundaries training in the next year. So that's why we're offering it 3 times a year. We'll probably need to, we've got 3 dates for next year. We're probably going to have to add a 4th if I had to guess, because otherwise that last one's going to be 100 people. But that gives you an outline of what is in the policy. We have a policy that was approved by COM, reported presbytery in August. We actually, it's nudged a lot of people to start taking the training. So, but I will make sure you have access to this policy, and it might be a good starting point for a congregation's policy. Any questions on boundaries training?
Why couldn't the congregations use that training, Andy, rather than trying to come up with something else on our own? If it's already available, why not let us use it?
Right now, our capacity to do it is not large enough to do it at the scale that would be necessary for every congregation, for all 85 of our congregations to take advantage of it. We barely have the capacity to do our ministers.
But
So
it
at
just
this
seems
point,
like
we're turning away. At this point, we're actually having to turn away church staff. We just don't have the capacity, because it's somebody who does this as it's a psychologist who does this training, and we just don't have the capacity right now. She cannot take more time away from her practice than she already is to do this training. So we are looking at, are there options there, et cetera. Long term, there may be more choices and we may have more capacity there. But especially at this time of transition, we have to focus on our immediate responsibility, which is our ministers. And we'll do what we can to support our congregations, but we've got, that's just that, it's that high of a priority right now. So we just didn't have the capacity to make it more broad at this time.
Does this policy not say anything about deacons, or is that something that I?
So the Book of Order requirements do not speak to deacons in the policy, because it talks about councils.
Okay.
And members of councils, and deacons are not a council of the church. They are a group of persons in ordered ministry who are organized sometimes in some ways. It would absolutely be appropriate for the session to include deacons in their boundaries policy and training requirements. I should probably, back on this others as directed by policy slide, I should probably add deacons as one of those who are included there. I'd say, although I think it's about 30 to 40% of our churches do not have deacons in the presbytery. So
Andy, we have 2 other congregations that meet at our church. Should we require like background checks on behalf of them for, like, if they have a nursery, and they provide their own nursery workers, is that on us or should that be on them?
that should be addressed in your agreement with them for the use of the space. Okay. I know situations where congregations do require that. I know situations where congregations do not require that. So it really is one that should be addressed in good conversation internally with that, within the session, in conversation with your partners, your nesting congregations and others. And this is a place where you have to involve your insurance company and or attorney. So I'm going to stop my share so we can have a little more conversation.
Andy, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We have the St. Andrew's Presbyterian School, which is a separate entity from the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. When we last did our operations manual review, we started with a small policy that's not going to meet all it needs now, but we started with something of the Miriam Project to set up some requirements for people working with children. We found out that what the school has to do by law is a lot more complex and difficult than what we found in any church policy. Mm-hmm. So I know I'm not going to be able to go to them and say, no, this is the policy you have to follow now. So I'm going to assume that I can just leave them alone. They're following their legal requirements and I don't have to worry about that, correct?
What I would suggest is that you be very clear in your agreement with them that they are the ones who are responsible for verifying all of those things for persons who are on your property. So that there is clear line of accountability that they are the ones who are doing that work and it's not coming on you. And you're going to honor that. You're going to, and I think in most cases that would make sense when it comes, what we've done for our ministers, because all of our ministers are directly accountable to the presbytery, regardless of regardless of what they're serving in, they have an accountability to the presbytery. That's why we are requiring them to have our boundaries training. Mm-hmm. So that's not something that necessarily everyone will do. I've gotten a couple grumpy ministers who are like, I spend 3 days a year in boundaries training at my hospital, at my school, at wherever. Like, I know you can spend 2 hours with us. Because there are some unique things about this for churches.
So in other words, it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. It really, I mean, there's so much that is highly situational.
I really prefer yes or no answers, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, there are a few things I could give yes or no answers on, but I have enough experience in the legal realm to know that that's not one that I can.
Okay, gotcha.
Any other questions or comments to share for this conversation?
Yeah, I have another one. So sure. Obviously there's 6 of us besides you on this Zoom call. Mm-hmm. So, and you know, there haven't been a whole lot of others in the previous sessions. How, I mean, Patsy and I have both gone back to personnel and to some others and shared some of the things that are required, but how is it going to be communicated to the congregations that aren't present here?
So this is one part of a communication strategy. We certainly are letting folks know through the newsletter, through announcements at meetings. Congregational consultants are in regular touch with congregations as well. We put this up on YouTube. People are watching this after the fact. I get emails from people saying, "Oh, I wish I could be there, but I can't. I'll go watch it." So yeah, so we, and it is not, and the new Book of Order is available. I mean, there are a lot of people who really wanted it when it came out. So because we had the same one for 4 years, and people were so used to it changing annually for the longest time. And we've got, so there's some of that's going on, but it's ultimately the responsibility of the congregation and its leaders to take care of these questions.
Okay.
We're doing everything we can, and we're happy to hear feedback on more ways we can do it, but we are, and there will be churches that don't do this. Some of them it doesn't really matter for. There's a good, I don't know, I don't have a number, but I'd say probably at least 20 of our 85 congregations don't have an installed pastor. And so the family leave requirements don't apply to them. If you're, the interim pastor at Oakhurst does not have to be given family leave. So that's so one of us on this call is part of a congregation where that isn't in place. So,
But
yeah.
wouldn't it make sense? Wouldn't it make sense to go ahead and put it in policy, since we are going to at some point have an installed pastor?
Right. Yeah. It's a good idea to get it. That's part of what we're doing, is getting there. But we have churches that are not at a place of having an installed pastor. 20,
Right.
25 members, you're probably not going to have an installed pastor. And so that they're not going to be involved in this conversation. And, they probably won't do boundaries training either, sadly. But, we do everything we can, and we put ourselves, ultimately we do what we can, and and the church has to put itself at risk by not following through. And the last thing I'll say is, probably the best way to put yourself at risk is to have a policy and not follow it. To have something written down and then have a pattern of just ignoring it. That's the worst thing you can do. So, and don't write something up just because you need it. That's another reason why we're cautious about providing templates, because it's really easy to take a template, make it policy, and never use it. Because it doesn't fit you. It's those clothes you bought and you never, with the intention of wearing, but you don't wear it because they don't fit right. So we don't want that kind of situation. All right, any final questions? Well, I am grateful for you all being with us this evening. It is always a joy to be with good and faithful Atlanta Presbyterians, and Annette, our the non-Presbyterian among us. But you're one of us. You're part of our family too.
She knows more than I do by a long shot about our church.
Well, I'm grateful for this, and may God bless us into this night and into our work in living this out as best we can. So that is our prayer as we end. Thanks for being with us, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Very good.
Night.